Most people picture Abraham as a primitive nomad, a Bedouin without an address, wandering the desert with goats and animal skin tents. The truth is something else entirely. The man who heard the most radical call in human history lived in one of the most sophisticated cities of the ancient world, with two-story houses, underground sewage systems, and a sacred tower rising 21 meters above the flat Mesopotamian plain. What he left behind was not poverty, it was an entire civilization. This is the story you were never told. Put it in perspective. We are around 2,000 years before Christ, in Ur of the Chaldeans, a metropolis of approximately 65,000 inhabitants on the banks of the Euphrates River. In what is today southern Iraq, British archaeologists Leonard Woolley and his team spent 12 years excavating the site of Tel el-Mukayyar between 1922 and 1934, and what they found completely inverted the image that common wisdom had constructed about Abraham's world. The houses of Ur were not raw clay huts. They were solid structures with fired brick walls 40 to 50 centimeters thick, built around interior courtyards that regulated the entry of natural light through architecture. They had functional bathrooms, clay latrines with seats, and drainage channels that carried wastewater out of the dwellings through underground pipes. Some of these houses had 2 full stories, with 10 to 12 rooms, space for extended families and months' worth of storage. The craftsmen of Ur worked copper, gold and silver with a precision that impressed the modern archaeologists themselves. The jewelry pulled from the royal tombs included lapis lazuli, brought from more than 2,500 kilometers away, from what is today Afghanistan, through a logistical trade chain that crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers with an efficiency that many later empires would have envied. The ziggurat of Ur, the step tower dedicated to the moon god Nana, rose 21 meters above street level, visible for kilometers in every direction across the flat Mesopotamian plain. For anyone born and raised in Ur, that structure was literally the center of the universe, the dwelling of the god upon the earth, the axis around which the calendar, the harvests, the rituals, the marriages and the deaths orbited with predictable regularity. The religious processions of each lunar month, the solstice offerings, the sound of priests atop the tower in the hours before dawn, all of it was the backdrop of Abram's childhood and youth, as he was called then. This is the equivalent of a man today leaving Berlin, Tokyo or Sao Paulo, with an apartment, a car, a stable job, a network of decades-long relationships and complete urban infrastructure, to walk toward a nameless horizon. Consider the family. Abram was the son of Terah, of a lineage that Genesis 11 records with precision tracing back to Shem, son of Noah. The family had sufficient means to maintain flocks, servants, and commercial relations in a city-state that was one of the greatest economic powers of the ancient world. Terah had initiated the move toward Canaan, leaving Ur with the entire family, including Abram, his wife Sarai, and his nephew Lot, heading west. But he reached Haran, 880 kilometers north of Ur, and stopped. He planted roots. He built again. He died there, at 205 years of age, according to Genesis 11, verse 32, never having reached the destination he had announced when he left. Haran was not a marginal stopping point. It was a central node in the trade routes between Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, and Egypt, a hub of worship for the moon god Sin that mirrored the religious culture of Ur with a comforting familiarity. The family that had left the metropolis found in Haran an environment familiar enough to rebuild a life, make new connections, and plant second-generation roots. By the time Terah died, the family was settled, with established holdings and a new network around them. And it was precisely at that moment of consolidated relative stability that the call arrived. Abram was 75 years old. Genesis 12 verse 1 records the words, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." No geographic coordinates, no map, no deadline, no description of the destination. The instruction was to move toward the unknown, with the promise of a destination that would be revealed along the way. Not before departure, not immediately after, but along the way. Consider the specific weight of what was being asked. In the ancient world, identity, legal protection, access to resources, and social belonging were entirely bound to the land, the family, and the clan. Leaving your country, your people, and your father's household was not merely a geographic change. It was the voluntary dismantling of the three structures that made life sustainable and meaningful in the historical context in question. It was the deliberate exposure to the condition of foreigner, of pilgrim, of someone stripped of the roots that the ancient world considered the foundation of any dignified human existence. And yet he went. Genesis 12 verse 4 confirms it with surgical precision. So Abram left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran, with Sarai, with Lot, with all the possessions they had accumulated, with the servants they had acquired, a considerable caravan, a village in motion, with flocks of sheep and goats and cattle, animal skin tents, cooking utensils, tools, pack animals, and everything that permitted survival in open territory for weeks or months. The route from Haran to Canaan covered approximately 700 kilometers in a straight line. But no route in the ancient world followed a straight line. The terrain forced detours around mountain ranges, river crossings at points where the current and depth permitted safe passage with animals, and mandatory stops at springs and wells that had to be found before thirst became a crisis. Groups moving with flocks and heavy loads covered between 20 and 25 kilometers per day in favorable conditions, over rough terrain with sick or exhausted animals, in storms, or in the extreme heat the Levant knows well in July and August, temperatures reaching 40 degrees Celsius, far less. The full journey took several weeks of continuous walking, crossing the territories of different peoples. And that journey was not an exception. It was the pattern of life that would settle in for the next 100 years. Observe what it means to exist as a nomad among cultures of fixed cities. Every movement of the camp required the dismantling of all structures, the loading of every utensil onto the pack animals, and the driving of the flocks in formations that balanced speed and the safety of the livestock. Every stop required fresh reconnaissance of the territory, identification of water sources, assessment of local peoples, and implicit or explicit negotiation of grazing rights. Every dry season forced displacements in search of pastures that the previous season had exhausted. Abraham's life in Canaan was a sequence of camps, altars, dug wells, disputed wells, alliances with local kings, and constant movement, never legally owning the soil beneath his feet, except for the single cave he would purchase at the end of his life. The accumulated physical toll of this way of life on aging bodies was real and concrete. Abraham built altars at Shechem, at Bethel, continued south, descended toward the Negev, went to Egypt, came back, traveled Canaan in multiple directions over decades. Modern medical studies on nomadic pastoralist populations document elevated rates of osteoarthritis in load-bearing joints in individuals over 50, chronic injuries to feet and ankles from irregular terrain, and pulmonary damage related to constant exposure to dust and sand. For a man who began this way of life at 75, after decades of urban living, the physical cost of the journey was a permanent reality that the text does not document in detail, but that human physiology leaves no room to ignore. Abram arrived in Canaan and passed by the great tree of Moreh at Shechem, and Genesis 12, verse 6, records the reality without softening it. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. It was not empty. It was not lying desolate waiting for him. It was densely inhabited territory, with populations established in walled cities, with kings and well-entrenched hierarchies of power, with land divisions that had no reserved space for a caravan just arrived from the north at 75 years of age. And there, in foreign and occupied territory, came the promise, "To your offspring I will give this land." Genesis 12, verse 7. Offspring. That word carried a structural problem that no outside observer could ignore, and one the text makes no attempt to hide. Sarai was barren. Genesis 11, verse 30 is direct, with the simple brutality of biblical language. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. This was not a passing or recent difficulty. It was an established fact, known inside and outside the family for decades. The promise of offspring had been made to a man whose marriage had produced no heir across decades of conjugal life. And Sarai was not young. She was 65 years old when they left Haran. That detail, the promise of multiplication to a couple biologically past the expected window of fertility, is the first loop that would develop across 25 years of narrative. And the weight would be heavier, more tortuous, and more humanly complicated than any summary can capture. But before the weight, there was immediate survival. Abram built altars at Shechem and at Bethel, continued south, descended toward the Negev, and then came the first major crisis: famine. Genesis 12, verse 10 is direct. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while, because the famine was severe. The winter rains had failed, the pastures had dried up. The flocks needed water and forage that Canaan could not provide at that moment. Scale the displacement. From the Negev to the Nile Delta was approximately 350 kilometers of desert and open terrain. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. The Nile guaranteed predictable harvests even when the rains failed in the lands to the east. But entering Egypt meant entering the sphere of power of Pharaoh, one of the most powerful rulers of the known world, with a sophisticated bureaucratic administration that recorded and processed every group that crossed its borders. A caravan with flocks and servants did not pass unnoticed. Abram made a decision that the biblical text records without editing and without justifying, beyond what Abram himself said. He asked Sarai to present herself as his sister, not his wife. Genesis 12, verse 13. "Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." The logic was explicit in the text. If the Egyptians knew Sarai was his wife and wanted her for Pharaoh, they might kill Abram to do so without legal obstruction. Presenting her as his sister, he would survive. There was a partial truth in it. Sarai was in fact his half-sister, daughter of the same father but a different mother, as Abram would confirm later in Genesis 20, verse 12. But the omission was calculated, and the consequences were immediate. Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's palace. Abram received in compensation sheep, cattle, donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. Genesis 12, verse 16. A considerable sum of wealth by any standard of the ancient world. The text does not record how long Sarai remained in the palace. There are no details about what happened inside those chambers, about what she endured, what she felt, how she survived what the narrative simply does not name. The silence about Sarai's inner experience in this episode is absolute and permanent. And that silence is itself a datum about whom the ancient narrative chose to make visible and who was left in the blank spaces. What the text does record is the intervention. Plague struck Pharaoh and his household. The truth came to light. Pharaoh confronted Abram. "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister'?" Genesis 12, verses 18 and 19. Abram left Egypt richer than he had entered, with Sarai, with Lot, with everything he had accumulated, plus Pharaoh's gifts. The episode was preserved in the text, not as a victory of faith, not as proof of divine protection validating the patriarch's strategy, but as the record of a man who chose his own survival, and the woman at his side paid a price that the narrative does not fully quantify and does not romanticize. The accumulated wealth became its own next problem. The flocks of Abram and Lot had grown beyond what the territory could sustain. Genesis 13, verse 6. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great. Disputed pastures, contested wells, economic tension between the herdsmen of the two groups that escalated into open daily conflict. Abram gave Lot the choice. Lot looked at the valley of the Jordan, irrigated, green, resembling Egypt in its visible abundance, and chose that direction. He settled near Sodom. The choice for the best visible terrain seemed strategic. Within a few years it would reveal itself as one of the most costly decisions of his life. But before Sodom, there is an episode that hasty readers underestimate and that historians take far more seriously: the War of Genesis 14. A coalition of 4 kings, Amraphel of Shinar, Arioch of Elasar, Kedorlaomer of Elam, and Tidal of Goyim, had dominated the region for 12 years, collecting tribute from the kings of the plain with the regularity of an imperial tax. In the 13th year, 5 kings rebelled. In the 14th year, the coalition returned with full force, sweeping through cities, destroying populations, taking captives and goods. Lot was among the captives. Abram received the news and responded in a manner that no stereotyped profile of an elderly patriarch would prepare you to expect. He mobilized 318 trained men from his own household, Genesis 14 verse 14, and went in pursuit of the coalition. He chased them to Dan, attacked by night with his men divided into tactical groups, defeated the enemy, and recovered Lot, the other captives, and all the plundered goods. Calculate what this reveals. 318 trained warriors belonging to Abram's household, equivalent to a modern light infantry battalion. Maintaining that contingent in combat-ready condition required daily provisions for hundreds of men, armament, continuous training, and a command structure that functioned with efficiency. Abram was not simply a wealthy, wandering shepherd. He was, in the political and military language of the ancient world, a chieftain with real power and the capacity for independent operation, the kind of figure that cuneiform texts of the period call a hapiru, a leader of an armed group operating on the margins of the great established kingdoms. On the return, the king of Sodom came out to meet Abram, and then the text introduces a figure who appears for only 4 verses in the entire Bible, but who generated centuries of theological, historical, and liturgical debate. Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High, Genesis 14, verse 18. He brought bread and wine. He blessed Abram, and Abram gave him 1/10 of everything, a tithe of the conquered spoils. Salem, the name that history would recognize as Jerusalem, the city of peace, the same hill upon which Solomon would raise the temple centuries later, the same soil that would hold the most significant events of the Christian tradition. But that connection belongs to the end of the ark, and the ark was still only at the beginning of its development. Follow the crisis that was growing in silence as the years passed. The promise of offspring had been given. Abram had traversed Canaan, survived Egypt, defeated a coalition of 4 kings, and Sarai had still not conceived. The time passing for a man who was already 75 when he left Haran was not abstract. It was biological, concrete, and relentless. Genesis 15 records a moment of declared vulnerability from Abram. God appears in a vision, promises protection and reward, and Abram responds with a direct, almost confrontational observation. "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless?" Genesis 15 verse 2. he points to his servant Eliezer of Damascus as the likely natural heir. This is not a declaration of unshakable faith. It is a man saying to the God who called him, "The reality before me does not fit the promise I received." The response transforms the scene. God takes him outside the tent and says, "Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, so shall your offspring be." Genesis 15, verses 5 and 6. Witness the moment in its concrete materiality. A man in his mid-80s standing under the sky of Mesopotamia with no light pollution from any modern city in any direction, only open plain and complete darkness above. The number of stars visible to the naked eye on a moonless night, far from any artificial light source, reaches approximately 5,000 across the complete celestial vault. For a shepherd who had navigated beneath that same sky for decades, every constellation was orientation, every star was reference, every movement of the firmament was a living calendar. Counting those stars was a task without a possible conclusion. "So shall your offspring be." And the text records, with the phrase that the Apostle Paul would quote more than 1,000 years later in Romans 4, verse 3, that Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Genesis 15, verse 6. The man who had presented his wife as his sister, who had confronted the promise with the empty reality of his arms, looking up into the bottomless sky, chose to believe. Shortly after, Genesis 15 records an alliance ritual that echoes legal practices of the ancient Near East, documented in cuneiform texts from the same period. Animals were cut in two: a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, a dove, and a young pigeon, and the halves were laid apart, forming a passage between them. In the covenant treaties of the ancient world, both parties to the agreement passed between the pieces, symbolizing that the fate of the cut animals would be the fate of whoever broke the pact. But in Genesis 15, verse 17, something different happens. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. Only one side passed through. The covenant was unilateral. It did not depend on Abram's performance to remain in force. The obligation rested entirely on the side that had done the calling. But the crisis of offspring did not resolve itself in a vision or an alliance ritual. Sarai had an Egyptian servant named Hagar, likely acquired during the passage through Egypt, possibly as part of Pharaoh's gifts to Abram, according to a careful reading of Genesis 12, verse 16. The Mesopotamian law of the period, documented in cuneiform texts, including the Code of Hammurabi and the laws of Nuzi discovered in the 20th century, was explicit. A barren wife could offer her servant as a secondary wife to her husband, and children born of that union would be legally the children of the primary wife. This was the system functioning as it had been designed to function. Sarai acted within that law. Genesis 16, verse 2. "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." The decision was culturally and juridically legitimate. It was rational within the available options after years of waiting. Hagar conceived, and then the text records, with a precision that reveals the internal dynamic of a household, that when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Genesis 16, verse 4. A woman who had been a servant began to look differently at the woman who had been her mistress. The internal power of a relationship had shifted, at least in Hagar's perception. Sarai complained to Abram with the phrase the text preserves, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering." Abram returned authority to Sarai, and Sarai treated Hagar harshly enough that she made the extreme decision to flee. Hagar fled pregnant into the desert in the direction of Egypt, back to her homeland, alone, pregnant with a son who carried the weight of a decision that had not been hers. She reached a spring of water in the desert, on the road to Shur, and there Genesis 16 records that the angel of the Lord appeared with an instruction and a promise. The child would be called Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. Genesis 16 verse 11. She returned. Ishmael was born. Abram was 86 years old when he held his first son. 13 years passed. The text moves through them almost without stopping. 13 years of life with a firstborn growing, of complex family dynamics between Sarai, Hagar, and Ishmael, of pasture lands, displacements, and routine. And then Genesis 17 opens with God appearing again, now with Abram at 99 years of age, with a declaration that changed the man's very name. No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham. Genesis 17 verse 5. Exalted Father became father of a multitude of nations, with a single letter added in the middle. And Sarai became Sarah. The physical and permanent sign of the covenant arrived with it, the circumcision of every male in the household. Abraham at 99, Ishmael at 13, every servant and foreigner in the household. Genesis 17 verse 23. All of this was done that very same day, a collective act, immediate, irreversible, the body marked as the record of a covenant that the flesh would carry until death. And then came the promise that defied any calculation of biological probability. Sarah, at 90 years of age, would bear a son. Genesis 17 verse 17 records Abraham's reaction without softening it. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? The patriarch, who had built altars, received visions, ratified covenants, and been renamed across decades, confronted with the concrete specificity of this promise about aged bodies, laughed to himself. The text does not soften it, does not excuse it, records it. Examine the scene that followed. 3 visitors arrived at the camp by the great trees of Mamre. Genesis 18. The hospitality protocol of the ancient world required offering shade, water for washing feet, and basic food. Abraham went far beyond. He ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf. Sarah prepared 3 seahs of fine flour, approximately 20 liters, for bread. A reception involving hours of preparation and the sacrifice of a genuinely valuable animal, all for 3 travelers passing through. One of the visitors promised that at the appointed time, the same duration as a complete human pregnancy, 9 months, Sarah would have a son. Sarah was behind the entrance to the tent and overheard, and she laughed to herself. 2 parents who laughed. A son whose name, Isaac, in Hebrew, he laughs or he will laugh, would carry forever the memory of those 2 laughs in the face of the impossible. But before Isaac, the text of Genesis places between the promise and its fulfillment the crisis of Sodom, as if the narrative required a counterweight of destruction before the joy of the birth. Abraham's intercession for the cities in Genesis 18, verses 23 through 32, is one of the most unexpected scenes in the entire biblical narrative. A man arguing with God, pushing the limits of what it is permissible to ask, reducing the number of righteous required from 50 to 45, then to 40, then to 30, to 20, to 10. At each round, the answer was affirmative. Abraham's persistence was not rebuked. It was met up to the limit of what there was to meet. 10 righteous people. The cities did not have them. Lot left with his daughters. His wife looked back. The most visually appealing city of the plain, the one Lot had chosen for its visible fertility and abundance, became ash and salt. Modern archaeology still debates the precise location of Sodom and Gomorrah. Candidates include sites on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, an area that geology confirms suffered intense seismic and volcanic activity in periods consistent with the biblical narrative. The Dead Sea lies 422 meters below sea level, the lowest point on the Earth's surface, and the geological devastation of the region is visible to this day in salt and rock formations that the landscape does not conceal. And then, between the destruction of Sodom and the birth of Isaac, there is a second episode that mirrors almost perfectly the one in Egypt. Abraham in Gerar with King Abimelech. Again, he presented Sarah as his sister. Again, she was taken to another palace. Again, the truth came out with consequences. Genesis 20. The same pattern on different soil with the same result, as if the narrative needed to record the repetition of the error before the fulfillment of the promise. The system did not work differently the second time. Isaac was born. Abraham was exactly 100 years old. Sarah was 90, the son of the promise, the son of laughter, the son of 25 years of waiting, the son of biology defied, of the covenant written in the flesh of every male in the household, was there, alive, named and voiced and demanding like a newborn. Sarah said in Genesis 21 verse 6, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." The laugh of disbelief had become the laughter of fulfilled astonishment. But Isaac's arrival created the tension that had been held in suspension since Ishmael's birth. Sarah saw Ishmael and demanded the expulsion of Hagar and the child. Genesis 21 verse 10. The text records that this distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. Ishmael was his firstborn, circumcised on the same day as he, raised in his household, recognized for 13 years as the only possible heir to the promise. The expulsion was not what Abraham wanted, but the instruction he received was to comply with Sarah's request. Hagar and Ishmael departed at dawn with a skin of water and some food. No flock, no servants, none of the support structures that made survival possible in the Negev desert. The water ran out quickly under the sun that the desert of Shur softened for no one. Ishmael, between 12 and 16 years old, depending on the chronological calculation based on the 25 years between Abram's call and Isaac's birth, reached physical collapse. Genesis 21, verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the shrubs. Hagar moved a bowshot away, approximately 50 to 80 meters, because she could not watch her son die. A mother placed in that position not by her own choice, but by the intersection of a cultural law. Another woman's infertility, a man's decision, and the rivalry between two sons of the same father. Silence. God heard the boy crying. A well of water was there. Hagar simply had not seen it before. Ishmael survived. He grew up in the desert of Paran. He became an archer. He married an Egyptian woman. His mother chose for him. From Ishmael came 12 sons, 12 princes, chiefs of 12 peoples that Genesis 25 traces by name. And Islam, a tradition that in the 21st century counts more than 1,800,000,000 followers, recognizes Ishmael as the direct ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad, making the expulsion on that morning the point of origin of one of the greatest spiritual currents in human history. The cost of that morning does not disappear because of the survival ending. It remains inscribed in the text with honesty as part of the price that Abraham's journey extracted from the people around him. And then the text takes us to Genesis 22, the densest, most analyzed, most debated scene in the entire patriarchal narrative, the episode that the Jewish tradition calls the Akedah, the binding. The text opens with a marker that is itself a reading instruction. Some time later, God tested Abraham. Genesis 22, verse 1. The reader knows from the first verse that it is a test. Abraham does not. The instruction was delivered with a precision that allows no emotional evasion. Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Genesis 22, verse 2. Each element of the sentence stacks upon the previous one. Your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. The text forces a pause at each layer of what was being asked, allowing the reader to skip none of them. Consider what was at stake beyond the bond of father and son. Isaac was the carrier of everything. He was the reason Abraham had left Ur, traversed decades of promises and waiting, received covenants, renamings, and signs. He was the convergence point of all 25 years of walking. Without Isaac, the entire structure of meaning that had organized every choice and every sacrifice in Abraham's life since Haran would collapse completely. And the instruction was for Abraham himself to close off that possibility with his own hands. Abraham rose early in the morning. He cut the wood. He saddled the donkey. He called 2 of his servants and Isaac, and he went. Genesis 22. In verse 3, the text records no hesitation, no sleepless night, no farewell to Sarah. And that omission, by itself, is weighty. It records methodical, immediate action, the movement of someone who has made an irreversible decision and is executing it before internal analysis can paralyze the feet. Mount Moriah was 3 days' walk from Beersheba, approximately 80 to 90 kilometers of rough terrain, crossing the Negev toward the hills of Judah. 3 days, with the sun at his side, with the wood being carried, with the weight of a knowledge that only Abraham carried in silence during every hour of that walk. 3 days of conversations along the road, of night camps, of shared meals, of the father looking at his son without the son knowing what that look carried. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He told the servants to stay with the donkey. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Genesis 22, verse 5. We will come back. The word is plural. It includes Isaac in the return. The letter to the Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 19, would interpret that word centuries later as the expression of a faith that stretched to imagining resurrection. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. Isaac carried the wood. Abraham carried the fire and the knife. The 2 of them went on together, and then Isaac spoke. Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Genesis 22, verses 7 and 8. The question of a son noticing what was missing with the direct logic of someone who had grown up knowing the rituals of offering, and the answer that carried the totality of a faith that could not yet see what it was promising. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Out and the 2 of them went on together. At the top of the mountain, Abraham built the altar with the stones of the place. He arranged the wood on it. He bound Isaac. He placed him on the altar, on top of the wood. He stretched out his hand. He took the knife. The text does not slow down here. And then, at that exact moment, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Genesis 22, verses 11 and 12. Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up. There was a ram caught by its horns in a thicket, and Abraham named that place, The Lord Will Provide, Jehovah Jireh. Genesis 22, verse 14. 2 of them descended the mountain together. The text does not record what was said between them afterward. The silence that existed between father and son during that descent is one of the most charged silences in all of human literature. The kind of silence that needs no words because any word would be insufficient for what had happened up on that summit. Later, Jewish tradition, especially in the Second Temple texts and in the rabbinic literature of the Talmud, developed the figure of Isaac as a conscious and willing participant in the Akedah, an adult, according to some traditions, 37 years old, who had agreed to the offering. This reading does not resolve the tension of the text, but it adds a dimension that the silence of the descent suggests. Not a unilateral imposition, but two men who had arrived together at the same point of surrender. Now examine what that mountain would become. 2 Chronicles 3 verse 1 is explicit. Mount Moriah is the same place where Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, the same piece of rock where Abraham had built that altar where he had bound Isaac, where the ram had been caught in the thicket. That soil would become, centuries later, the Holy of Holies of the temple, the geographically and spiritually most sacred point of Judaism. The location where the high priest entered once a year on Yom Kippur to make atonement for the people. The connection that Christian theology developed, recorded in the letter to the Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, and elaborated by the early Christian writers, points to the same mountain 2,000 years after Abraham's altar. An only son carrying the timber up the hill, a father who this time did not stay the blow, the same ground, the same ascent. A resolution that Abraham's altar had rehearsed without Abraham knowing he was rehearsing something on a scale that no stone altar on the mountain could contain. Sarah died shortly after the Akedah, 127 years. Genesis 23, verse 1. The text does not explicitly connect the two events, but the Jewish tradition, particularly the Midrash, did not let the temporal proximity pass unnoticed. Abraham went to mourn for her and to weep over her. And then he rose to negotiate a burial place, because even after decades in Canaan, he owned no land. The negotiation with the Hittites for the cave of Machpelah in Genesis 23, verses 3 through 18, is one of the most detailed legal records in the entire patriarchal narrative. Preserved with the precision of a notarial document, the Hittites offered the field as a gift. Abraham refused categorically. He insisted on paying full market value. The final price, 400 shekels of silver, weighed out in the presence of witnesses at the city gate, the official court of the ancient world. Approximately 4.5 kilograms of pure silver, a price probably above the market value of the field. The strategy was juridically precise and definitive. Paying a high and irrefutable price before public witnesses at the city gate created an incontestable record of ownership that no future heirs of the Hittites could challenge with legal arguments. The cave of Machpelah became the only piece of land with clear legal documentation that Abraham possessed in Canaan during his entire life. And there, across the following generations, they would be buried: Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah. 6. 3 generations of patriarchs and matriarchs, all in the same cave of rock purchased for 400 shekels of silver. Abraham lived another 35 years after Sarah's death. He married Keturah. He had 6 sons: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah, listed in Genesis 25, verse 2. He gave them gifts and sent them away to the land of the east while he was still alive. Isaac received everything. Genesis 25, verses 5 and 6, a new separation, a new distancing of sons not belonging to the main line of the covenant, with a human cost that the sons of Keturah certainly felt in ways the text does not document, but that human experience does not permit ignoring. Abraham died at 175 years of age, Genesis 25, verse 7. The text describes him with the dignity of someone who had completed a full journey. He breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. One of the most serene descriptions of death in the entire biblical narrative. And then Genesis 25, verse 9, records who buried him. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah. Both sons, side by side. Isaac, the son of the covenant, the son of fulfilled laughter, the heir of everything. Ishmael, the firstborn, expelled with a skin of water, the son who had grown up in the desert of Paran under the sun, his mother had feared would kill him. Reunited beside the body of the father who had fathered them in entirely different ways, with consequences that the following centuries would never cease to feel. The city of Ur of the Chaldeans, where everything had begun, was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across the centuries. The ziggurat that dominated the horizon when Abraham was a child was partially restored by Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, approximately 1400 years after Abraham had departed. The Assyrians passed through. Alexander the Great passed through. The Persians, the Parthians, the Sassanids, the Mongols of Genghis Khan swept through the region in the 13th century of our era. Today, the archaeological site of Tel El Muqayya lies in southern Iraq, a few kilometers from Nasiriyah, in a region that witnessed intense military conflict between 2002 and 2004 of the Christian era. The same soil where a man once heard something that led him to abandon everything and walk. Haran still exists as a small city in southeastern Turkey near the Syrian border. Local residents point to what they claim is Abraham's well and structures associated with the patriarchal family. Archaeology neither confirms nor refutes these traditions with certainty, but it does confirm that Haran was an active commercial center and a hub of lunar worship precisely in the period the narratives describe, with patterns of naming and social organization that the biblical texts mirror. The archaeologist William Foxwell Albright, one of the 20th century's foremost specialists in Near Eastern archaeology, documented that the historical framework of the patriarchal narratives is consistent with the period between 2000 and 1500 years before Christ. Names, legal practices, migration patterns, and social structures that the texts describe find precise archaeological parallels in the same period, including the practices of adopting servants as heirs documented in the laws of Nutsi, the law of wives offering their servants as secondary wives, the covenant rituals with animals cut in two, and the purchase of property with documentation before witnesses at the city gate. The tradition that Abraham initiated has been preserved for 4,000 years, first in oral memory, transmitted from generation to generation in tents and around campfires by families who carried the story as a more valuable inheritance than any flock. Then recorded in texts that survived empires, exiles, persecutions, and the destruction of every civilization around them. The text of Genesis arrived in the 21st century, translated into more than 3,200 languages and dialects, an extension to which none of the civilizations that existed in Abraham's time can be compared. Today, approximately 4 billion people belong to the three traditions that recognize Abraham as father in faith: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. More than half the human population of the planet in 2026. Each tradition sees him from a different angle, emphasizes distinct passages, has developed the theology of the same patriarch in ways that frequently generate conflict among his heirs. But the man at the center is always the same, the son of Terah, who was 75 years old when he left Haran without a map. The civilizational impact of a decision made on a plain of Anatolia 4,000 years ago is literally incalculable. Wars have been waged in the name of this legacy. Empires have been built around texts that record this story. Cathedrals, mosques, and synagogues have been raised on continents that Abraham never knew existed. Laws have been codified on the foundation of the ethics born from this tradition. Calendars, feasts, practices, and rituals of billions of people organize time around events that have Abraham as their point of reference. The Jewish Passover, the Christian Christmas and Easter, the Islamic Eid al-Adha, which commemorates specifically the Akedah, the act of binding, the ram in the thicket. And above the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, the only piece of land that Abraham possessed, with clear documentation in Canaan, stands today the Cave of the Patriarchs, one of the oldest structures still in use in the world. The exterior walls were built by Herod the Great, approximately 2,000 years ago, with stones more than a meter wide, each weighing between 2 and 8 tons per block. Still intact and visible, one of the most contested and protected sites in the modern Middle East. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all lay claim there, on the same stones, over the same soil, above the same rock, to the same inheritance that Abraham left without ever seeing to whom it would arrive. Abraham never saw any of it. He died with 2 sons and the cave where a wife was buried. He did not see the Exodus. He did not see David. He did not see the temple. He did not see the exile. He did not see the return. He did not see the 4 billion spiritual heirs who would one day carry his name as the foundation of faith. He planted without seeing the harvest. He built without seeing the completion. He walked without seeing the destination. The story of Abraham is not about a flawless hero executing promises with linear perfection. It is about a man who lied twice out of fear, who laughed at the promise he loved most, who expelled a son under pressure, who went to Egypt when he should have stayed and stayed in Haran when he should have gone, and who even so, early in the morning, rose, cut the wood, saddled the donkey, and went. Not because the logic permitted it, because there was something more real than logic, something the text calls faith, and for which 4 millennia of human civilization have not found a better word. 4,000 years have kept that name, and the stones of Herod still stand in Hebron, covering the rock that a man purchased for 400 shekels of silver when he needed a place to bury someone he loved, not knowing he was founding the only permanent piece of a legacy that no tax, no exile, and no destruction would ever erase. That is what remains when everything else passes.